Hello, hello, and welcome to another episode of Micro-Frontends in the Trenches. Today, I don't want to say too many words about our guest. I just say two, Zack Jackson. And if you are in the Micro-Frontends world, probably you know that is the creator of Mojo Federation, and probably you know that it's extremely technical, is extremely approachable, and I know him even before he launched Mojo Federation. So, without further ado, Zach, welcome to the show. How are you, man?
Lu- I'm very good, Luca. Thank you for having me on here. I am very happy to be here.
You must be in a Micro-Frontends podcast. So, if who better than you should be in here? Like you revolutionize basically the way how we build Micro-Frontends. So, you must be in a podcast like that, right?
I would hope so. I would hope so. Very appreciative to be here. And yeah, actually, I was thinking the other day about micro-front, and I think a Git issue came in, and somebody was asking, like, how do you do micro front end? They wanted to do multiple websites with a single kind of like post build. And I was like, okay, yeah, well, what framework are you using? This is easy. They're like, oh no, we're not using any framework. And I'm like, wait, so there's no React? It's just normal JavaScript? Yeah. And I'm like, oh, okay, I got to go back to like 2015 or the Backbone JS days when I was doing this. I got to pull out like all the old solutions to how to do something like that. It was very great to have that moment to think about how far everything has come, like one in Federation, but just two in general with all the tools now that we have and solutions that are available compared to like 10 years ago.
Oh yeah.
It's a whole different world. I think it was still edge side includes and iframes back then, or maybe we were just getting out of that.
No, we never get out from iframes. I think it's they are still there, and they will remain for the foreseeable future. Unfortunately.
Well, at least your header isn't in an iframe anymore. So, we're getting there.
So, for people that don't know you, who you are, Zach?
Yeah, so I'm a infrastructure architect at ByteDance currently. I work on Webpack, I work on RSPack, lots of stuff in dev tooling space. Generally trying to solve like the larger problems of scale that we have in front ends, and then of course own, operate, and maintain the whole module federation ecosystem alongside a group of maintainers nowadays.
Absolutely, and you are doing an outstanding job over there. To be honest, from my point of view, so thank you for that. The community, I think, is highly appreciated. If you lived under the rock and you don't know what Mojo Federation is, Zach is going to tell us what it is in an elevator pitch, like in the proper American way. So give us an elevator pitch of Mojo Federation.
Okay, so the easiest way to think about it is let's take a look at your normal web development. You have a really big project, lots of teams generally own different parts. Let's say a common structure I go to would be you probably have a team that might own your navigation. You might have a team that owns, say, a product page separate from maybe the landing page of the website. The payment processing and checkout is most likely a separate area of the site as well. But generally, these teams need to consume each other's code or work together. So you would then get into, okay, well, we put everything in npm package, so it's shareable. And then that's really great. But what happens when the thing you own is two npm packages deep? And now you need to npm install your package into the parent, npm install that one into the parent, install it into the app, and then release the app. And now if you need to synchronize this across many applications, the process quickly can take, 4 or 5 hours, assuming your QA is ready to go and your deployment is all good to go, which usually it's not a smooth process. So the idea behind Module Federation was really, is it possible to dynamic import chunks from a different build? I want to share code, but I only want to download the code I don't already have. So if I already have React, I don't want to download React as well. I want to just download, say, header, the JSX code, or the dependencies that header has that my application does not already have. So it's a way to um, import code at runtime dynamically from multiple independently built or deployed applications or parts.
Exactly. And that's where the magic happens when we talk about micro-frontends, right? So that is one of the mechanisms that we can use definitely nowadays. So with that said, I'm curious, when these ideas spark in your head? So like you were, I don't know, drinking a beer, or you were talking with a QA, or what is the story behind that? So what was the moment that you said, I need to build something, and then later on became Mode Federation?
So okay, so the where it all happened, I was actually working at Fiverr. So I used to work there on one of the product teams, and I ended up getting interested in a lot of the infrastructure work over there. Back then, this was like, when React, I think 14 had just come out. Um, and SSR was new. And so what we had done is we had like this Rails app that was the parent, and we wanted to have all these new React components. So what we ended up creating was this thing called, at the time we called it Medusa, which is where I got the name for a different Medusa. But what Medusa would do is you basically had something kind of like Renovate Bot. So whenever we would make a change to the micro front end, we would npm publish the package, wait 10 minutes, and the bot would pick it up, automatically open a pull request to Medusa. You would press merge, and Medusa would kind of be like the server rendering layer. This was and then we would use post requests from Rails to get the HTML and inject it back in, and so on and so on. Uh, as that kind of grew and grew, I realized actually we need to be able to do code splitting during the server side render. And at the time, this was, kind of not really possible to do. If we're looking at like 2015, 2016, it was barely possible to do that. I think 2015, maybe it wasn't. And so then I actually started working. I took over maintaining a project called React Universal Component, which was like the first code split SSR solution. So the original author of it, he's the one who opened the pull request for require resolve weak. And that is still how like loadable component, how, Next.js dynamic, how all of the work is based off of that mechanism to be able to, require the code without actually importing it, but equate like a weak reference to it. So I got really big into maintaining the ability to do code splitting in SSR. And I thought, oh, well, this is really great. And then obviously from the fact that this Medusa layer was, you make your npm package and the bot picks it up and installs it into the render layer. And then I started to see, oh, well, I have to go 2 or 3 packages deep. Like I have to update the sidebar and publish that to npm, and then update my micro front end and publish it to npm. And then I have to wait 10 minutes because you can't just manually go and update the render layer. It had to be fully automated to keep, you know, engineers from making any mistake. And that would end up taking a long time. And so I think it was one night I was in New York walking back from somewhere one night, and I was talking to the original author of React Universal about this. And at some point and at this point I was becoming totally obsessed with code splitting. I had become like the code splitting guy. I got jobs just because I knew how to code split apps really, really well. And eventually came up with the idea of like, hey, but why can't I code split a chunk from a different build? And so this was maybe 2016, end of 2016, when the idea got in my head. And then I moved to Washington, and around 2018, the obsession continued to grow. And then I think in 2019, finally, like something actually materialized. And in the original version, it's still on it's still on GitHub if you want to go and find it. It's called a Webpack External Import. And that was the initial idea of what is now known as Module Federation. So that's kind of where it all started. It really came from the pain that I had felt having to wait like 45 minutes to get, sidebar into production when all I did was change the font size. Like it didn't, like the amount of time you spent versus what you were doing seemed so low yield, and it drove me crazy. So yeah, for me, I think I grew up on like the jQuery and Backbone JS days, or, I originally started out with jQuery and WordPress, and, uh, I have never been able to get over the enjoyment I had of jQuery widgets. Like, as long as it's gone on, I can't get over the DX of the ability to just FTP, and it's there and it's immediate. And ever since then, things have gotten progressively more painful in terms of getting the code out. In terms of like scaling the code, definitely jQuery is probably not going to be the solution, but that has come at a price. And I have never really been able to get past the whole idea of, but it used to be so simple. And now it seems like we've lost a lot to gain some other things. And so that's kind of where the obsession started.
Yeah, I think is let's say an obsession that and also a pain everyone had in the past, but you were resolute enough in order to arrive to deliver something that was extremely helpful. And thanks for making it open source, by the way, because I think it's not for granted these things. So I think it's very important. So nowadays, fast forward 2024, we are finally in Mod Federation land with version 2 released this year. So what did you do in version 2? What are the main difference compared to the first version?
So I guess, going back to how I got the idea of Federation, it was very uninformed. It was, I have a problem and I want it to go away. And that was it. There was no consideration about anything else beyond like, I just want my problems to disappear and I don't think anybody else will use this. So I'm just going to solve for me. And that's essentially what V1 was, is it was Zach's problem gone away without thinking about the fact that it would end up being as popular as it did. So obviously nothing was really designed to think about this, like how it ended up getting used. Nobody really knew what would happen to it. So due to that, there were also a lot of design issues in how it was built. I think, there's some famous ones like you can't dynamically load the remote containers. If you lazy load them, the share scope will tear, which basically means like how the sharing system essentially works is it's, a simplified version of this is like object freeze. So once the consuming app, uh, thinks it knows its shared modules with whatever remotes it can see right now, it'll object freeze its scope and then consume, say, React out of it. But then if you click a few later and another component lazy loads a new container like dynamically, um, that one will also object freeze, but maybe it has a better version of React. It'll use a better version of React because it can, but the original one is already frozen and there's no way to unload it. So, problems like this started to pop up, or issues with like single runtime chunk were really painful to try and get around. Or, I think a big one was just there was no deterministic control. So you can reload the page many times and you'll always get a dependency you want, but it can come from anybody who has it. So there was just a lot of, a lot of things that I didn't think about in it. And I think, the other factor is as well, yeah, I think you really only are kind of exposed to the scale that you have to solve a problem on. And at the time, the scale that I had was, I think how I had envisioned it, the largest implementation of Federation I had imagined was, maybe having 75, maybe 100 remotes. And that would be, for the whole company to run. And that was kind of the upper ends of scale.
Yeah.
But then I joined ByteDance in 2023. And I find out that it's the largest user of Federation, and we've got, thousands to tens of thousands of remotes active at any given point across the entire, portfolio, which was obviously at a scale I did not believe possible. So naturally, it was never designed to handle that type of scale. I didn't think that type of scale was realistic. Um, so V2, a lot of this really came down to, okay, well, one, what have the users had issues with? What are the issues that I have had with it? Um, and then, what are I think over 4 years as well, you just kind of, learn lessons. So a big one would be like better ways to dynamically load the code. Before you would have to manually do it. We didn't have any utilities for it. We didn't have any kind of runtime for it. You would just like window.get and a window.init, and that was all you had to work with. There was no way to handle like if errors would happen or, other kind of disaster recovery was really, really difficult. You couldn't change the URL if you use the plugin. There was no easy way to say, oh, well, I need a way to detect if I'm in development mode and then use localhost. Otherwise, if I'm in production, use a different URL. You would have to rebuild and redeploy the application to change all the references. So, little basic things that could have been done better. I think another really big one was TypeScript. So I obviously I'm not a fan of TypeScript, but I can appreciate, its usefulness. Um, I think that's a really big thing. If you're also dealing with a distributed system, maybe that's a place where type safety is maybe a little bit more important than just you want TypeScript in the app where you can just go and click on the function. What happens when the function isn't there and it can change whenever it wants to? Then maybe remote type hinting and things like that are a lot more important. So V2 was really, trying to solve, a higher category of issues than just, Zach's problems one night walking on the street in New York. And to try and look at, okay, what do we need for like a real big enterprise scenario? I think another big issue was, at the time of joining the company, RSPAC had just been announced maybe like a few months prior. So coming into the company, we knew Federation, like since ByteDance is a large user and we are building this new bundler, it's mandatory that Federation exists in RSPAC. Now, how do we create it again in Rust while also having to understand that we still have Webpack builds in the company. So am I going to write everything two times over? Okay, so then how do you synchronize and maintain this new thing that now has to support two different bundlers? And if we're doing that, then how much further do we go to be able to support other bundlers? So, a lot of things kind of snowballed in here to, okay, I think the best thing to do is come with a new V2 design where we can handle all of these things. We can decouple from Webpack, which I think was probably the biggest negative factor. I know, like, maybe some of the issues that I have mentioned here are in the reality of like everything I read online, they're probably the negative ones. A couple major users will bring these up, but mostly people have been okay with V1 despite all the flaws. But for V2, there was a different like set of issues that we really needed to go after.
But I think
And
also the fact that you decouple basically Emoji Federation from Webpack due to what you just explained, I think is a massive win for everyone, because then we have seen the contribution from like people like Giorgio that did the possibility to use Vite, and now I can let's say build my module in wherever bundler I want and share it across bundlers, or loading in pure JavaScript. Like there is the version of Emoji Federation 2 that enables me just to load it inside in pure JavaScript without any bundler. That I think overall is a very smart move, because you open up basically the ecosystem even more.
yeah, and so I got a little off track on. I was trying to remember where I was going, my original line of sentence, but yes. So the biggest challenge that we had run into, or I think the thing that held Federation back the most toward the end of the cycle was really, oh, but it's Webpack only. And like anywhere you go online, that'd be the number one negative to Federation compared to like import map. I think single spa was still quite a big competing project at that stage. And the main selling point of a lot of other solutions was it is not Webpack only. I would say we were probably maybe a year and a half too late to starting to do this before things, before, faster bundlers started to come out. The rise of Vite happened, all of that. And Federation was really hindered by being locked to a single bundler.
Yeah.
So, like, what we ended up doing is we said, okay, what if we re-implement this? So the reason we actually designed the runtime the way we did is because Rust is hard. And most of the engineers on the infra team are JavaScript engineers, including me. I know some Rust, but, primarily I'm going to opt for JavaScript if I can before having to dive into the Rust side. So we needed to come up with a design that would minimize the amount of engineering effort in Rust. So the easiest way to do that was to create an agnostic runtime that the bundlers implement. So there's a plugin that sits on top that basically does things like organize the chunk, reroute the dependencies, does some resolving, things you would kind of expect. And then all that the plugin does is prepare the chunks accordingly and generate the maps. And then it basically passes us a series of objects to the runtime, and then the runtime is driving everything else. So that allows us to continue to support Webpack. That's how Vite can be supported. And that's how we also get the vanilla runtime where, hey, if you don't have a bundler to use, you can also just use the standalone runtime package because that's all the bundlers are implementing. The only difference is that the bundlers can create something like the remote entry file.
Yeah.
But a little later on, when I was experimenting with ES build support, I created a function called create container, which basically you pass the Federation config, but you can also pass exposes, and it would just be a dynamic import, and it'll return the get and init interface.
Yep.
So again, cool. Then if we've got all of those capabilities, we just need the runtime to be able to interpret it. So while the compile time gives you more slickness, less manual effort, you still can just use the vanilla runtime as you want, which I think now has allowed us things like, that we aren't even focusing on, like say Vite. That's not a major priority on the compiler side, but it is now possible to do by partnering with, big individuals in the micro-frontend community, like Giorgio, who he's worked a lot on the Vite one prior when it was still in V1,
Yeah.
and then when V2 came out, I think it was him, Zephyr Cloud, some of the help from some of the ByteDance individuals, and then we worked on adjusting our runtime to handle more ESM only scenarios to kind of comply with what Vite requires. I think in some places we still used a few shortcuts where we'd lean on like the Webpack require variable, and when Vite support came along, it really kind of made us fully get rid of any of the things where we were depending on hooking into Webpack's existing runtime, and we had to ensure everything ran through the hooks, everything worked properly in ESM, all of that. But, ultimately now it's led to this a much, much better place for micro front end, at least for Federation
Yes.
in terms of micro front end. I always try to, the way I kind of think about it is when we're looking at micro front end, I would say Federation is the closest thing to a standard for micro front ends that we have right now. I know you have import map, but I don't really consider that a standard for micro front end.
It's a
It's a web
mechanism.
standard. Yes, it's a mechanism, but it reminds me a lot of V1. Cool. It will link your code from A to B, but then that's it and you're on your own. And what happens if you need React Native or if you need server side rendering or, some other random environment, you're very constrained. But, now saying let's say we have we have a rollup plugin there's a few things that we still need to merge to solve that, but we have rollup, we have Vite, we have Webpack, we have RSPack. So that is 4 major build tools that now support module federation. And we know with Vite in roll down, it's going to be a first class supported solution. So with I think this is the best time for Federation as well, or even for micro front end. For if you want to build in different technologies, you absolutely can. And you know that the runtime is backed by the original authors of the system and it's safe by, a well-resourced group, but you can implement this however you want and it will remain consistent. And again, seeing it become like first class in many of these, if you have Webpack and Vite and let's say RSPack, if they support it as first class, I would say that does account for probably the majority of builds that are happening today. So that's why I always say, oh, we've almost got a bundler standard here because covering the group of bundlers we have effectively puts it in the hands of the majority of the internet.
Totally. And you mentioned React Native. I think is useful to highlight to all the audience that Mod Federation can run also with React Native for mobile applications, because very often I have this question, like what would you use for building my front ends in React Native? So a question probably you might have more than once, and not just from me, is okay, with React Native, there are any limitation that we have with Mod Federation?
So they would be the limitations of React Native or how it works. So the engine doesn't have an event loop. So there's no promises. So this makes some challenges because Federation is, by design async. The other challenge is that React Native, you can't load scripts like you can in the browser. Everything has to go back through this bridge. So you have to tell the native side to load the script, and then you will get the script after the native end does all the IO for you. So that's the only constraint that I've really seen from it is
So a bit of
it's a little
latency, basically.
not even the latency. It's more just, there's no dynamic import. So there's a bit
Yeah.
more setup. The nice thing though is if you like CallStack owns Repack, the build plugin for React Native. And so they have Webpack and RSPack support. And I believe they just released the either release candidate or the beta. Not sure, but they've released the beta for Module Federation V2 on for React Native, and in there they have some really nice examples, like building super apps where there's like maybe 10 or 11 micro front ends inside of a native application, and it's all running as you would expect. So I think this was also the nice thing from our runtime is we incorporated this runtime plugins design. So it gave the ability to intercept basically all the important areas of the life cycle of Federation. And this became especially useful for CallStack and for React Native because before they basically would kind of fork the plugin and recode everything for the bundler because you would have to create like new targets, and there was a lot of manual work the user would have to put at the top of the file and things like that to get it to work. But now that they're using V2, they say that all of that is now just a runtime plugin for React Native, and they can more or less just use the standard compile plugin that we provide, and they just add the React Native runtime plugin. And I think they have their own plugin to add a couple extra presets and stuff like that. But we're looking at incorporating, preset React Native or preset Node back into the Federation plugin, so to minimize the wrapper that they have to put around it. But it's significantly better. So I would say now with the V2 one, you're going to get a much more unlimited experience compared to what we had with V1, where it wasn't limited per se, but you had to do a lot of the manual stuff that you would have to. There were many steps you would have to follow.
Indeed.
But now, yeah. So in terms of limitations, I don't really know of any limitations in there. You should be able to do just about anything that you could do with the web or with Node. You can do with React Native.
That's amazing. So, considering we were talking about mobile devices, where is the most unexpected place where you have seen running Module Federation?
Traffic drones.
Nice.
So that would be it. So there was a company so they have these drones that fly around in the sky, and they essentially monitor traffic patterns and stuff like that. So the company used Federation as the deployment mechanism. So they were actually shipping assembly to the drone, but they were using Module Federation as the transport layer. So they were able to update these drones while they were still in the sky, and they were able to deliver new payloads to them while they were still flying in the sky, which I thought was probably that was definitely the wildest thing that I had heard of. Is like, because I always refer to Federation almost, oh, you kind of build the plane as it flies because all the things snap together, and they were literally like redeploying the application as it's flying in the sky, which I thought was that was something
Oh,
I'd never
wow.
anticipated. I would say that the second most, so that was the craziest one that I heard of. The one that's more traditional that I've heard of has been, it's going to either be that it's in the cars. So if you know Rivian, the electric car company, so apparently their onboard computer, the infotainment systems, all of that is using Module Federation. And then the other craziest one, which is the most popular one, is that there is a certain game console that I am not allowed to say which one, but there's a certain game console that many of us have in our house, and the entire UI system for it is Module Federation, updating the Bluetooth controller firmware. The connection layers is all Module Federation. All the UI elements are Module Federation. And you might have seen that the game console in general, it does not have as many updates where you have to reboot the system.
Yeah.
And that used to be a big issue, and that has largely gone away. And so they had told me, yes, it's because we can deliver the majority of updates to the console over Module Federation.
Nice. That's wonderful, man. I'm super happy for you. So the other burden question that I hear all the time from customers is that so imagine that you have like a next application you want to move to micro-frontends, right? And usually when I speak with them, I'm helping them to rationalize how to implement the architecture using micro-frontends. And then the question is, okay, but can we use module federation? Because I'm usually modularizing at the infrastructure level, so they can have like their own well-splitted application in group of pages or whatever other way that they want to handle that. But then they want to go a step further and they want to move into, let's say, a federated approach for portion of the view. Now, the challenge I've seen that for a while you supported and the team behind the working with you, all the maintainers were supporting Next.js. Obviously, Next or better Vercel announced that they're going to move into their own solution of using micro-frontends. And if you're interested, there is a recorded episode that I've done with Malte Hubel, that is the CTO of Vercel. But I saw that literally a few days ago, you decided to made in maintenance mode the Next.js plugin of Module Federation. So can you tell us a bit more about the motivation and what's happening behind the scenes so everyone is aware? Because I know that many people are always on the fence saying, am I betting on Module Federation for Next or not? Should I do that? Or what it is basically that where you stand basically?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that the plugin has been a very painful development life cycle overall. Um, I think like maybe back in when Federation first came out, there was some alignment between me and Vercel. I think me and Guillermo got on a Zoom call in the early days. Like I think this was just when COVID started to happen. We'd gotten on a call and we kind of raged about, oh, this could be really great, and we spoke about the potential, and that obviously kicked off a lot of excitement. I think ultimately the directions went in a different way. I think, Vercel kind of went, I know they acquired Turbo Repo shortly around this period as well. And I think, often, they kind of shifted toward the, bigger, faster, cacheable monolith approach. Or, they went into, say, the mono repo with Turbo Repo and stuff like that. Ultimately, our paths just diverged. And I had kind of bet on Federation landing in there, so I obviously needed a solution to it. And so Next.js MF kind of came out. I would say that the big challenge really has just been that if Vercel doesn't want Next to support something, then it's not going to work well. And that is essentially what has just happened over time. It's been a very slow death of the plugin. It never worked well to begin with, and it had periods where it worked slightly better. But in general, the Next.js plugin has always been the worst experience a user could get of Federation. So I've tried I've tried for a very long time to make it better, but ultimately, like if we look at how long it took to create V2, V2 was maybe 3 months of work from us. But the next plugin can regularly take 6 month stints of work to keep it functional. And then
Yeah.
still it's a fraction of the quality compared to every other user, every other framework that we work with. So it really it just came down to it's not the amount of resources pushing into it come at a major cost to the rest of the ecosystem. And while yes, now I work at ByteDance and I have more resources, and obviously our ecosystem has grown thanks to the team being bigger. If we look back when I was working at Lululemon, for example, it was basically just Module Federation V1 and then a handful of like little packages that I had built out. But, I would say maybe 70 to 80% of my time was solely dedicated to the Next.js MF project. And that really has not changed over time. But but now we're at this point where this ecosystem has expanded drastically, and we have a lot more options available. So the amount of time, it just it's not worth it. The more time that we push into this integration, which clearly the vendor does not want it on their platform, at least from my outside perspective, I don't believe that Vercel wants Federation to work on it. They have their own solution coming out, which you probably have more info than I do because you've spoken to him. I need to go watch your video. That's what I need to do. Um, but it's essentially without the support of the framework in some capacity, it's not going to work very well. And now the directions are just, again, diverging to the extent where things like AppRooter, we can make it work, assuming we could tweak a handful of things in the core framework. We can't. So AppRooter will never work. So then we're left with the pages router. We have TurboPack coming out. So while yes, the decision to now kind of sunset it's really just been a slow burn that finally over the weekend, there was no aha moment. It was just really, okay, I think it's time now to just, you know, start the notice period that the thing has been. We've already started to reduce capacity since V2 came out. The major update we did was to get next onto the V2 layer. And then we haven't done a ton of work on it in favor of things like remote type hinting or the ability to do dynamic type hinting, where you can have dynamic remote and the browser can send the type data, back to your machine on the fly, elements like that. So it really just became, it requires a lot of resources and it's not wanted. And TurboPack is on the way, and we don't know if TurboPack is going to support Federation. So the timeline was already set. Its death was already written on the wall. And, it just kind of became the point of, okay, well, maybe we call it now, or at least start warning users that, hey, it's definitely not going to get much more work unless a new maintainer wants to take it over. That said, we are still committed to providing to make sure that our ecosystem tests against it pass until mid to end of 2026, which at that point, I would imagine Webpack would probably maybe still be there. But at that point, hopefully TurboPack production would actually exist. And, at this stage, we would probably see a lot of the users want to go toward what Vercel is selling or creating.
Yeah.
So, really, writing is on the wall. And while it's a difficult decision to retire it, ultimately, the Federation has never worked well there. It's never going to work well there. And we have other framework authors who do actually want the technology on their frameworks who will work with us. And we would rather put that effort into collaboration versus offering a substandard solution to users.
Okay. Thanks for the explanation. I think is crystal and clear now, and everyone will take their own decision the moment that they have implemented Module Federation with Next in their system. So considering we are towards the end of this episode, the question that you can expect right now is very easy. What's the future holds for Module Federation?
What is the future? So, okay, so a really big one that I want to add, which I think, so a lot of Federation has been filling out the ecosystem. What we've kind of seen, I think RSPack, we learned a lot from RSPack. What made RSPack really good was it had an ecosystem from the first day it was announced, and that ecosystem was Webpacks. And I think in most cases, the ecosystem is what defines the success of something that's not just like Lodash or, a standalone library. It really counts on, well, what else can it do? How far can it go? What's the penetration of this technology? So a lot of, I think, what we're kind of looking at is how do we round out what it does? So what it started out as was, I want to dynamically import chunks from somewhere else. What we realized is you actually need a lot more than that. You need things like what happens when there's multiple frameworks or different versions of frameworks that need to load. So, we've done things like introduce the framework bridge system, which allows you to have, special connection points that will say, merge the state from, Vue and React's router, so that you can click on a link in a native Vue app and a React router app will update its state, and they can cross boundaries more effectively. So now that we have that, that was also, I think, one of the things that Single Spa did really well. They had this pattern where, hey, apps, you could do it was called the LOSA pattern, lots of small application. And so Single Spa did that really well. It's got this thing that mounts things onto DOM nodes. And that was something Federation didn't really have. It kind of went again on my opinions of it, which is I like the ability to just import from. I wanted it to be the same as NPM style. You can use Federation in many ways, like you can use it with single spa and so on, but primarily people are drawn to the fact that you can use require and import and it just magically works. And you don't need to learn anything beyond what do you want to share and what do you want to expose, which is a pretty low barrier to entry. But while I wanted to keep it as low barrier as possible, you do need more to kind of control it. And so I think, so one of the things that I want to bring out, we already have the kind of mounting layers now, which provides something like single spa. And then I think a really big one that I'm excited for is I want to introduce, so we already have runtime plugins and our hooks that allow you to intercept the loading of the module, to control the sharing, case by case, to handle error loading. But a big one that I want to add is the ability for users to register their own hooks into the app, into the instances. Because of how Federation is designed, the the node, let's just call it the node. So the node inside of the application tree knows where it is. So you have this contextual node where, hey, remote A knows if header is importing it or if host app is importing it. And the runtime plugin, you can make a decision based on, hey, if so and so is importing it, behave differently than if somebody else is importing it. Or if you're the main node, behave differently than if you're a child node. Like if you're the host, do something different than if you're the remote. So this context system is really powerful. It's also universal. So
Yeah.
it's available everywhere, built in. You don't need any library, anything like that. So it seems really, really primed for something like communication outside of the module loading that we have defined. So what I'd love to do is give the ability for users to create their own hooks, because then imagine if you want to say set some state or send an event to another micro frontend. Currently, this is really challenging to do. We could use maybe Jotai or a browser event or Redux or something like that. But then that's usually framework locked. And on top of that, you need to share it and you have to figure out how to make it work and then figure out how to use it. And then everybody has to stay synchronized.
Yeah.
But what if so the ability at a user hook, imagine you could just say, okay, I want to like tap the hook and listen for when somebody dispatches this event to me. So unlike a browser event, it's not global. So you can actually go to an instance. So you could say like, okay, I want to go to header and I want to tap header for when header gets data or something like that. And whenever header gets data, it'll fire this hook and you can respond to it. But inversely, you can also choose header and subscribe onto it or dispatch info and send it directly to header. So it's very explicit. So, the fact that it's universal means cool, Angular, Vue, whatever, you don't need some kind of state machine, but you could send the event here and it could work in React Native. It could work in Node.js. It could work in any environment. And you could customize it as you want it to be customized with the context of it and, all the kind of richness that the ecosystem has. So that's a really big one that I'm excited for is user hooks, ability for user to actually have an eventing system built into our runtime, backed by our runtime, which would then get rid of, probably the last major problem I see in the day-to-day challenges of Federation is how do you communicate with these front ends? And this has been a tale as old as time. um, so some other areas that we have kind of looked at, so a bit more on the experimental side, one thing we're looking at is like the ability to tree shake the shared modules. So I think this is always a catch-22, and it is really challenging though if you just think about the mechanics of it.
Of course.
Let's say it's Lodash. Okay, well anybody can import named imports from Lodash, but they can be redeployed at any given time. So how do you prepare the Lodash to be tree shakeable, given that anybody could change what they're using from it at any given point in time? And then sure, they could provide their Lodash, and obviously because they're consuming it, they could maybe the last guy has the most exports because they could analyze whatever's going on. But then what happens when you introduce versioning? And now you have okay, so I need to match it on Simver plus available exports. So it gets really like computationally complex to retain. Um, so anyway, so trying to do it at compile time, I don't know if it's possible, but we're looking at designing a new intermediary format, like output format for RSPack. So instead of outputting JavaScript, or let's say it would output JavaScript, and similar to source maps, it would output a new chunk data structure that's designed for a Rust edge worker.
Yeah.
So when if your infrastructure is available and you have this edge worker, you'll have not RSPack, but you'll have one of the crates that's also used in RSPack, the linker and the sealer essentially. So we could say, okay, we could ingest these chunks as they're being requested, and we could analyze the data structure and then perform that. Okay, who uses what and where? Because we can run Federation on the server, but we can also run the algorithms that will calculate what it does in the browser. So I can either load the script that I want, or I can run the algorithm that will tell me which script it's going to load. So if I can then replay what the browser is going to do, plus I have this intermediary format, we could say, okay, optimize the code or tree shake the code as it leaves your infrastructure. And then if you don't have this layer here, it just uses the original JS format, which is untree shaken. So trying to introduce things to, have more optimization,
Indeed.
like more intelligent optimization. I think in the edge layer, there's a bunch of really cool stuff that we could do. Another one that's a lot easier than the intermediary one would be adaptive remote generation almost. So imagine if we had RSPack, we deploy it to like an edge server. It's a REST service, so it's super fast. And anything that you want from it, it can create the remote that you want on demand.
Yeah.
So you could have like a cloud remote that is the vendor, like similar to how you have a vendor chunk. Imagine if you had a vendor remote that wasn't at compile time, but as you send a request to this remote, it automatically generates the things that your system is asking for. So if you want React at some random version, similar to how ESM.now works, you would have similar kind of idea, but delivered over the kind of bundled and optimized formats that Federation provides. But the ability to say, oh, well, as the system decides it wants some version, the version doesn't need to exist in your system, but you could pull that version from the registry or similar to how ESM does it, but you could get a remote created that can have everything that's available on NPM for you at exactly the version you want. Then you have good caching, you have, all the other benefits that you want, and all of that stuff can stay within your own infrastructure. You don't necessarily have to go to like a third party source for loading this. Or, have like a CSP on your domain or anything like that.
Yeah.
So trying to look at how we can make it more adaptive, a bit more flexible in terms of what happens if we treated the runtime as part of it, but what if there was also a edge worker counterpart? And what happens if this runtime actually was designed to communicate on both ends so that the system as one is technically server and browser runtimes coordinating with each other on the fly to kind of figure out what you want it to do. So I would say those are probably some of the most fancy aspects that we're looking at. We do have some other things, other various things that we're looking at implementing. Like we would we're bringing out a native framework at the end of this year, early next year, and we would like to see more native support just baked into to these frameworks from the get go. I know in 2025 we are looking at introducing RSC and Federation support in our own meta framework. So we have modern JS, and that's what everything at ByteDance runs off of. So obviously it's a very easy place to go to. And we're currently working on the RSC Rust stuff that we need for RSPack. So we kind of own all the, similar to Vercel, we have all the pieces we need to make whatever we want it to do. So it gives us a really good chance to kind of go off and do that. So that's another avenue that we're going to look at is, okay, what would the RSC world look like under Federation? I think also it'll be a good timely thing to look at, considering that the next support is going to be, is now put into maintenance mode, providing a better alternative that could still have some of the sought after features that I think users love Next.js for is an important factor to have. So so yeah, things like that as well. I would say in general though, for Federation, I think the goal for us is to try and get it to a stage where we have all the ecosystem parts that we believe we need for it, and then to also not add things just because they're fun to add, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
At some point, when do we reach the point where loading dependencies has reached the stage it needs to be at? So I think with V2, we've made a very large improvement to get there. But I also believe that there's there's a point where we're going to reach equilibrium where, hey, it does everything exactly how we want it to do, and there's no more you need to add to it, at least under what technology offers today. So I believe that we will probably in the next year or two, we'll probably reach that point where we go, hey, module loading is a done story. Like it works, it does everything it could do that we need it to do, and there's probably nothing left to do in this area. Um, but then once we reach that point, it's going to be, well, how do we harness this technology to build things off of it that are, again, more powerful?
Yeah.
Federation is always kind of just, okay, well, that's layer one. We need a way to do fancy things at runtime. But once we do that, we build really good tires for the car. But now at some point you want to, put the car on the tires. So, so a lot of this has been building the tires to then what do we go off into next? What could we do with, say, Rust powered tech where things are much faster, where we can do this much more adaptively?
Yeah.
And then, how does that play into what we could build? I think a big one that I'd like to see is I'm hoping that in 2025 we'll introduce it, but this ability to support edge worker, like Cloudflare edge worker, so that you could have an edge worker where you only have one worker, but you could have effectively unlimited number of code bases that are just uploaded to a store, similar to what we do with AWS. You have Elastic File System, you can upload 1 million code bases to it, and you could deploy one Lambda. And that one Lambda could be all 1 million code bases, and there's no more infrastructure beyond the first Lambda, and after that, it's concurrency of that Lambda, and then you're back to FTP. So, I think there's probably more improvements we can do around the server side of things, how we can coordinate this, how far we can get it out on the edge services. But then after that, barring any new developments, I think, or any new input from the community, I think that, in general, it's just going to be refining what we have, filling out some of the areas like user hooks, the ability to bridge these frameworks in, making sure our TypeScript works, type syncing works, bundler support in other bundlers. And then probably around that point, it's going to be, okay, well, then what do we build with this? How do we incorporate it into it? And I think we're already starting to explore that in some areas, like with RS Press. So that's our documentation tool from RS Pack. So at ByteDance, obviously, our packages get really complicated. So what happens when you have one NPM package that depends on, say, 50 others, and they all have documentation as well? So now the product team is going to look at this package and they need to read the docs for it, but these docs might be dependent on the packages that it imports. Now you have 100 doc sites at 100 different versions, and it becomes very, low density to try and read the docs of what's going on. So, again, talking about how do we shift from worrying about module loading to utilizing module loading, one thing we're rolling into RSPress is the ability for federated documentation to be loaded in. So when you're doing your static generation of the pages for yours, depending on the versions that you use, if that other npm package is also built with RSPress or has RSPress docs, we can actually pull the documentation parts that are relevant and embed them into your doc site as well at the version of whatever the packages you're using. So now you have a really robust Explorer where you can explore very complicated documentation setups, but it all just like comes to you rather than you having to click around or have links to it. But how do you pull it together to manage really large organizations where there's many different versions of this thing that can exist or many different compositions, and the composition or version changes what the documentation is? So how do you make that into one easy to navigate and find doc page? That's not necessarily a front-facing product, but I think these are the challenges that come with scale. And ultimately, the goal of Federation is really to enable solutions for scale. So a lot of our things are going to turn to, well, how do we leverage what we have built now that we've refined it, which took several years to kind of get to.
Absolutely.
Another exciting one that we have is we have RSlib as well, which we've introduced. RSlib is essentially RSpac's like tree shake bundler friendly package building solution. So Webpack is terrible at building NPM packages. It's really good for last mile, but it's terrible for outputting good tree shakeable ESM packages for another bundler to consume. So RSlib is essentially a new target that we've designed that, solves a lot of these problems and makes it, a very efficient format, a very efficient what do you call it? Basically RSlib outputs a very efficient input format for bundlers to consume, where they then create the very efficient output format for the browsers to consume, and so on. So a cool thing that we've added into it is when you build it, you can say, okay, I want to build a CJS, ESM, and module federation. So you can author an NPM package, which off the bat, you can build it to these three targets. So, more ability where, hey, your package authoring can incorporate federation. And then we want to look at, okay, well, could we add maybe a new resolver or like a new named export that, hey, if this named export exists on the package JSON, um, field, then you could say, hey, opt to use the Federation version of this module and don't actually bundle it in, but here's the link to like the interface for it, and maybe it just bundles the container interface, but all that does is maybe connect it to your CDN. Or you have ways to install like Symver versions of your remotes without actually having to bring in all the bundle bloat of it, and actually still have like the module sharing system available, or just ways to author NPM packages that do natively understand module federation and are built in with it. So, again, trying to find how do we improve these pipelines from docs to package authoring. I think those are probably going to be where the big movements happen.
That's super cool, super exciting as well. So thank you very much for sharing. Any final words from you for all the Module Federation fans out there?
Any final words? I would say, yeah, if there's anything that you want to see in Federation, obviously, a get issue would be a good thing to note down. We have, our ideas, of course, but I think a lot of this comes from the community as well. Maybe things that we haven't thought of or things that we would like to see happen. Definitely get in touch with us. And then I think maybe the last one, just to shout out, if anybody does want to take over maintaining Next.js integration, then definitely get in touch, because we are happy to unshelve it if one, a new maintainer comes along, or two, Vercel decides they do want better support for it. So it's in the hands of the community at this point.
Fantastic. Zach, thank you very much for your time. It was an absolute pleasure, as usual, talking with you. Or nowadays, we had several chats at conferences around the world, so I always glad to have spent some time with you, man. So I really like that. Yeah, so thank you, and enjoy the rest of your day, and see you in the next episode of Micro-Frontends in the Trenches.
Thank you for having me.
Bye bye.